The Montana Territory in the year of 1888 was a land of stark beauty and brutal realities. The wind howled ceaselessly across the vast plains, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant echo of coyotes. Here, nestled amongst rolling hills and craggy outcrops, lay Wildwood Ranch, a sprawling property that bore the indelible mark of its solitary owner, Arthur Bear Caldwell. He was a man of immense stature, a veritable giant in a land accustomed to hardy folk, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and his silence as profound as the canyons that scarred the landscape. Bear lived a life of self-imposed isolation, the sprawling ranch his only companion. The main house, built from sturdy timber hewn by his own massive hands, stood as a testament to his resilience, yet it also felt empty, each echoing footstep a reminder of what he had lost. Years had passed since the tragedy that had befallen him, a dark cloud that perpetually hung over Wildwood, shaping his every interaction, or rather, his lack thereof. He believed himself cursed, a bringer of sorrow, and thus kept his distance from the scattering of settlements that dotted the territory. His only solace was the demanding work of the ranch, the endless cycle of tending cattle, repairing fences, and ensuring the survival of his livestock against the harsh elements and occasional predators. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, Bear was rounding up a stray herd near the Blackwood Creek. He moved with a quiet efficiency that belied his size, his presence enough to guide the cattle. It was then that he heard it, the faint but unmistakable sounds of distress carried on the wind, the frantic whinnying of horses, the panicked shouts of men, and something else. A cry of pain that pierced through the vast stillness. Instinct, a primal urge honed by years of surviving in the wilderness, took over. He urged his own sturdy horse, a powerful Mustang named Thunder, into a gallop, following the direction of the sounds. The terrain grew rougher, the trees thicker, but Bear pressed on, his massive frame leaning low over Thunder's back. He found them in a small clearing, a scene of chaos and violence. An overturned wagon lay on its side, its contents scattered. Several rough-looking men on horseback were ransacking the remnants, while a few settlers lay injured on the ground. A single woman was struggling against the grip of one of the bandits, her face pale with terror. Bear didn't hesitate. With a roar that echoed through the clearing, he charged into their midst. The bandits, startled by the sudden appearance of the behemoth, scattered momentarily. Bear dismounted Thunder, his movements surprisingly swift for his size. He grabbed the man holding the woman, his grip like iron, and with a swift motion tossed him aside as if he were a rag doll. The other bandits, seeing the formidable figure before them, hesitated, their predatory gleam replaced by a flicker of fear. A brief but brutal fight ensued. Bear, though outnumbered, fought with the raw power of a grizzly. He used his size and strength to his advantage, felling the attackers with swift, decisive blows. The bandits, realizing they were no match for this enraged giant, quickly mounted their horses and fled, disappearing into the darkening woods. As the dust settled, Bear turned his attention to the injured settlers. Among them, lying near the overturned wagon, was the woman he had rescued. She was pale and still, a dark stain spreading across her side. Kneeling beside her, Bear felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in years, a flicker of concern, a stirring of empathy. He gently turned her over, his large hands surprisingly tender as he assessed her wound. He knew with a grim certainty that if she didn't receive help soon, she wouldn't survive the night. And in that moment, despite his vow of isolation, Bear Caldwell made a decision that would forever alter the course of his solitary existence. He would take her back to Wildwood. Carefully, with a tenderness that belied his massive frame, Bear lifted the injured woman into his arms. Her slight body felt impossibly fragile against his immense build, a stark contrast of strength and vulnerability. He carried her as if she were a precious, delicate child, his movements deliberate and gentle, mindful of her pain and the precariousness of her condition. The other settlers, bruised and shaken survivors of the brutal attack, watched in stunned, disbelieving silence as the giant rancher, a figure they had only heard whispered, almost mythical, tales about, became their unexpected and unlikely savior. Before leaving, He instructed the least injured among them to tend to the others as best they could, and promised, his deep voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, to return with proper help as soon as humanly possible. The ride back to Wildwood was painstakingly slow and arduous, a torturous journey under the deepening twilight. The woman remained utterly unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged, each inhale a fragile battle. Bear held her close, the unexpected warmth of her body a strange and profoundly unfamiliar sensation against his own, a warmth that stirred something long dormant within him. The profound silence of the ranch seemed to deepen even further as he carried her inside the main house. The familiar emptiness of the vast timber-framed rooms now held a new, terrifying element, a fragile, flickering life hanging precariously in the balance. He laid her gently on the large, sturdy bed in the guest room, a room that hadn't been used in years, gathering dust and silent memories of a time long past, a time when laughter and life had filled these very spaces. Bear had no experience whatsoever with tending to the injured. His life on the ranch demanded more brute strength and raw resilience than delicate medical care. Panic, cold and unwelcome, flickered within him, a sensation as unsettling and unwelcome as the haunting memory that often tormented his sleepless nights. What if he couldn't save her? What if he failed again? He quickly found some clean linens, rough but clean, and a basin of cool, fresh water. With a deep breath, he began to meticulously clean her wound as best he could, his massive fingers surprisingly deft. It was a deep, ugly gash on her side, bleeding steadily, a cruel testament to the violence she had endured. He recognized the work of a blade, sharp and intended to inflict maximum harm. As he worked with painstaking care, he took a closer, more detailed look at her face. Even in her unconscious state, there was an undeniable strength in her features, a determined set to her jaw, a delicate but resilient curve to her brow. Her hair, the color of spun gold, was matted and tangled with dirt and her own blood, a tragic halo around her pale face. He worked through the long, silent night, driven by a profound sense of responsibility he couldn't fully explain, a primal urge to protect. He kept a roaring fire burning in the hearth, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, pushing back the encroaching darkness. He bathed her forehead with cool water, the damp cloth a soothing touch against her feverish skin, whispering silent, desperate pleas for her to hold on, to fight for her life. The house, usually filled only with the sound of his own solitary breathing and the familiar creaking of the old timbers, now echoed with her shallow, fragile breaths, a delicate rhythm that he found himself listening for with an almost desperate, prayer-like intensity. As the first hint of dawn broke, painting the vast sky with soft, tender hues of pink and gold, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of a stormy sea, initially filled with a profound confusion and then a sharp, piercing pain. She looked slowly around the unfamiliar room, her gaze finally settling on the towering figure of Bear, who was sitting vigil by her bedside, his usual stoic and unreadable expression softened, almost imperceptibly, with a hint of profound relief. A flicker of raw fear crossed her features, a natural reaction to the imposing giant, before it was slowly replaced by a cautious curiosity, an intelligent assessment. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak and raspy, barely a whisper. Bear gently offered her some water, which she drank in small, hesitant sips, her throat clearly parched. He spoke to her in a low, rumbling voice, explaining what had happened and assuring her with an earnestness that was palpable that she was safe, for now, at Wildwood Ranch. He told her his name, Arthur Caldwell, though most called him Bear, and then waited patiently, watching her with an unreadable expression as she slowly, painstakingly, began to piece together the fragmented, terrifying events of the previous day. The silence that followed was profoundly different from the oppressive emptiness he was used to. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, with the fragile beginnings of a connection forged in violence and nurtured by an unexpected act of profound kindness. The whispers in the empty house had found a new voice, a voice that held the potent promise of change, though neither of them could yet foresee the long, winding path that lay ahead. As the days slowly turned into a week, the injured woman, whose name Bear now knew to be Cora, slowly but steadily began to heal. The deep gash on her side, though still a painful reminder of the brutal attack, was gradually, miraculously, beginning to close under Bear's surprisingly diligent and tender care. He applied salves he made from local herbs, changed her bandages with a gentle precision, and watched over her with an almost paternal concern. Cora was a woman of quiet, inner strength and keen, perceptive observation. She noticed the surprising gentleness in Bear's large, calloused hands as he tended to her wounds, the way his brow would furrow with genuine concern when she winced in pain, and the almost palpable loneliness that seemed to emanate from his massive frame, despite his imposing physical presence. Cora, a trained nurse who had been traveling west to join a medical practice in a burgeoning town, was not easily intimidated. While Bear's sheer size and imposing demeanor were initially startling, she soon saw beyond his formidable, gruff exterior. She recognized the profound weariness in his dark, haunted eyes, the deep lines etched on his face that spoke not of anger, but of hardship, loss, and an enduring sorrow. She sensed, with an innate empathy, that the profound silence that surrounded him was not born of malice or indifference, but of a deep-seated pain, a burden he carried alone. As her physical strength slowly returned, Cora began to cautiously explore the ranch house. It was a sturdy and remarkably well-maintained structure, a testament to Bear's hard work, but it felt strangely devoid of personal touches, devoid of warmth. There were few decorations, no photographs, no trinkets that spoke of a life lived with others, and an overall sense of a life lived in stark isolation. She often found Bear immersed in his demanding work, his massive frame a familiar silhouette against the vast, rugged landscape, a lone figure against the immense sky. He was a man of few words, answering her questions with brief, often monosyllabic responses, as if speaking too much might break some unspoken vow. One late afternoon, as Cora sat on the porch, her healing body finally able to enjoy the fresh air, watching the sun dip slowly below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in vibrant, breathtaking hues of orange, purple, and crimson, Bear unexpectedly joined her. He sat a respectful distance away, his gaze fixed on the distant, silent mountains, a familiar pattern of quiet contemplation. A comfortable silence settled between them, a silence that was no longer heavy with unspoken tension or awkwardness, but rather a quiet, mutual acknowledgement of their shared space, their shared existence. Cora, emboldened by the growing sense of ease between them, decided it was time to gently breach the formidable wall of his silence. "Wildwood is a beautiful place, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, her voice carrying a genuine admiration. Bear grunted in acknowledgement, his gaze not wavering from the mountains, but a subtle shift in his posture suggested he was listening intently. "You've built a good life for yourself here," she continued, her voice gentle and encouraging, "though it seems lonely, unbearably lonely." This time his gaze flickered towards her, a hint of something unreadable, a flicker of raw emotion in his dark eyes. He looked away quickly, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly in his jaw, a sign of his internal struggle. "Some are meant to be alone," he finally rumbled, his voice low and gravelly, laced with a deep resignation. "Do you truly believe that, Bear?" Cora countered, her gaze steady and unwavering, challenging his assertion with gentle firmness. "Or is it something you've simply convinced yourself of, a shield against further pain?" Bear remained profoundly silent for a long moment, the only sound the chirping of crickets beginning their twilight chorus. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, raw and thick with the pain he had tried so hard to conceal. "There are things in my past, terrible things, things that make it better if I am alone. I've learned that those I care about, they tend to suffer, they tend to leave." Cora's heart ached at the raw, visceral pain in his voice. She knew then with absolute certainty that behind his stoic facade lay a deep, festering wound, a lifetime of unresolved grief. "Everyone carries scars, Mr. Caldwell." "Bear," she said softly, reaching out to gently touch his arm. "The important thing is what we do with them. Do we let them define us, consume us, or do we find a way to heal, to carry them as a part of our strength. He turned to look at her then, his eyes searching hers, a desperate plea for understanding hidden in their depths. It was the longest, most direct, most vulnerable gaze she had yet received from him. In those dark, tormented depths, she saw a flicker of profound vulnerability, a desperate longing for connection that he desperately tried to suppress, to push back into the shadows. "Some scars, they never truly heal," he said, his voice heavy with an almost crushing resignation. "Perhaps not completely," Cora conceded, her voice still gentle. "But they can fade. Their edges can soften. And sometimes the best way to heal our own scars is to help someone else heal theirs, to share the burden." The silence returned, but this time it felt different. The air was thick not with tension but with unspoken emotions, with the fragile, tender beginnings of trust. Cora knew she had only scratched the surface of Bear's profound pain, but she had seen a crack in his formidable armor, a fleeting glimpse of the wounded soul within. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her being, that she wanted to know his full story, to understand the shadows that haunted Wildwood and the silent giant who lived within them. The vast and empty ranch had begun to echo, not just with silence, but with the faint, hopeful whispers of shared vulnerability and the hesitant, precious promise of healing. As Cora's physical wounds mended, a gradual but significant change began to occur in the dynamic between her and Bear. The initial emotional distance, a chasm born of their different worlds and his profound solitude, began to lessen, replaced by a fragile understanding and a shared rhythm. They fell into a comfortable routine, a silent dance of cooperation and quiet companionship. Cora, ever practical and resourceful, took on household chores, her nursing skills proving invaluable in treating the minor injuries Bear had long ignored, considering them part of the rancher's life. She learned to navigate his silences, understanding that they were not always a sign of dismissal or a gruff withdrawal, but often a reflection of his deep internal struggles and his natural quietude. She respected his need for space, and in return he gave her the space to exist in her own way. Bear, in turn, found himself anticipating her presence, a subtle shift in his solitary existence. The vast, empty silence of his home was now punctuated by the soft sounds of her movements, the gentle hum of a song she would sometimes hum to herself, the low clatter of plates. He would occasionally offer her small gestures of kindness, a freshly caught fish he had speared from a nearby stream, a handful of wild berries he had gathered on his patrols, knowing instinctively that she would appreciate them. He even started speaking more, his gruff voice softening slightly as he answered her questions about the ranch and the surrounding territory. He found himself telling her about the land, the wildlife and the history of Wildwood, in a way he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. However, the memory of the attack lingered like a dark shadow. Cora was profoundly grateful for Bear's protection, a debt she knew she could never fully repay. But she also knew that the bandits who had attacked them were still out there. The territory was vast, untamed, and unforgiving, and law enforcement was scarce, often days or even weeks away. The threat felt palpable, a constant undercurrent of unease that rippled beneath the peaceful surface of their newfound calm. One crisp morning, as they were tending to the small vegetable garden Cora had started near the house, a little patch of green life in the wild landscape, they were interrupted by the foreboding sound of approaching horses. Bear's body tensed instantly, his massive hand instinctively moving towards the rifle he always kept close, a constant companion. 3 men rode into the yard, their faces grim and hardened by a life of violence, their hands resting on their gun belts in a clear display of menace. One of the men, a wiry fellow with a predatory gaze, dismounted. "Caldwell," he said, his voice rough and laced with a thinly veiled threat. "We heard you tangled with some fellas last week, claimed you interfered with their business." Bear stood tall, his massive frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over the intruders. "They were attacking innocent travelers," he stated simply, his voice low and firm, a rumbling defiance. "Innocent or not, it ain't your concern," the man retorted, taking a step closer. "This here's our territory. You cause trouble, you'll have to answer to us." Cora, a wave of cold fear washing over her, stepped forward, her presence surprising the men. "They were trying to rob and harm us," she said, her voice clear and steady, despite the tremor of fear she felt. "Mr. Caldwell acted in our defense. He saved my life." The men exchanged quick, assessing glances, their eyes lingering on Cora before returning to Bear. The leader sneered, a cruel twist of his lips. "Looks like the giant's got himself a pretty little friend. Might be a shame if something were to happen to her." Bear's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint appearing in their depths, a barely contained fury that promised swift and brutal retribution. "You threaten her, you threaten me," he warned, his voice a low growl, a sound of pure menace, "and that's a mistake you won't live to regret." A tense, suffocating silence hung in the air, thick with unspoken threats and simmering violence. The men seemed to weigh their options, assessing the formidable figure before them, a man who seemed to embody the wild, untamed nature of the land itself. Finally, the leader let out a short, humorless laugh, a sound of bitter retreat. "All right, Caldwell. We'll let it slide this time. But keep your nose out of our affairs. Next time you might not be so lucky." With that, the men remounted their horses and rode away, their departure leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Cora felt a shiver run down her spine, the encounter a stark reminder of the ever-present dangers of this untamed land. Bear turned to her, his expression grim and unyielding. "They'll be back," he said, his voice flat with a chilling certainty. "They don't take kindly to being crossed, and they'll be watching us." Cora's heart sank, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "What are we going to do?" she asked, a plea for a plan in her voice. Bear looked out at the vast, sprawling expanse of his ranch, his gaze resolute and unyielding. "We'll be ready for them," he said, a hint of steel in his voice. The fragile peace they had begun to build felt shattered, the tranquility of Wildwood once again overshadowed by the potential for violence. The uneasy truce with the outside world had been broken, and both Bear and Cora knew that the lingering threat would continue to loom over them, forcing them to confront not only the dangers of the territory, but also the growing bond between them in the face of shared adversity. The terrifying encounter with the bandits stirred something profound within Bear, a reluctant and painful acknowledgement that his solitary existence could no longer shield him from the dangers of the outside world, especially with Cora now under his roof. He became more vigilant, his senses always on high alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble, any hint of a threat. He also found himself thinking more about his past, the things he had alluded to that had led him to seek isolation in the first place, the shadows he had desperately tried to outrun. The encounter with the bandits had brought them rushing back with a vengeance. One evening, Cora found Bear in the dusty, quiet attic of the ranch house, a place she had never seen him enter. He was sifting through a large, weathered trunk filled with old belongings. He looked up, startled, when she entered, a flicker of his old guardedness returning to his eyes, a brief, painful flash of his need for solitude. "Just exploring," Cora said gently, her voice soft and non-threatening, noticing the somber, almost haunted expression on his face. Bear nodded slowly, then turned back to the trunk, his movements stiff. He picked up a small, worn wooden toy, the paint faded and chipped from years of use and a child's love. He held it in his large hand, his gaze distant and filled with a deep, consuming sadness. The toy looked impossibly small in his massive palm. Cora sat down beside him, her presence quiet and non-intrusive. She simply waited, a silent, empathetic listener. After a long, heavy silence, Bear spoke, his voice low and thick with emotion, a sound of profound grief. This was my daughter's," he said, his gaze still fixed on the toy, his fingers tracing its faded contours. "Lily." Cora's heart ached at the raw, unvarnished pain in his voice. She had sensed a deep sorrow in him, a profound grief, but this was the first time he had spoken of its source, the first time he had opened the door to his past. She waited patiently, allowing him to continue when he was ready, knowing that to rush him would be to break the fragile moment. She was caught in a fever," Bear continued, his voice barely a whisper, the memory a physical weight on his shoulders. "The doctor was days away. I did everything I could but it wasn't enough." His large hand clenched around the small toy, his knuckles turning white. "I promised her. I would always protect her. I failed. Tears welled up in Cora's eyes as she listened to his heartbreaking confession. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm, her touch a gesture of shared humanity. His muscles were tense beneath her touch, coiled with years of guilt. "Mr. Caldwell." "Bear," she said softly. "You couldn't have known. Sometimes these things happen, no matter how hard we try to prevent them. It was not your fault." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a grief so profound it seemed to consume him, an endless well of sorrow. "But I should have done more. I was strong. I was big. I should have been able to save her." He paused, his voice breaking with a raw sob. "Her mother, Sarah, she never forgave me. She left. She couldn't stand to look at me, to see what I had failed to protect." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for Cora. The isolation, the profound guilt, the entrenched belief that he was a bringer of sorrow and misfortune. It all stemmed from this devastating, unresolved loss. "You blame yourself for something that was beyond your control," Cora said, gently but firmly, her voice a soothing balm. "You were a father who loved his child. That's all anyone can ask." Bear shook his head, his gaze returning to the small wooden toy. "I failed them both," he repeated, his voice filled with an utter, self-loathing despair. Cora sat with him in silence for a long time, the weight of his grief heavy in the dusty air of the attic. She didn't try to offer platitudes or easy comfort, knowing they would ring hollow. She simply sat beside him, offering her presence, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, a quiet offer of solace. As the sun began to set, casting long ethereal shadows across the attic floor, Bear finally stirred. He carefully placed the wooden toy back in the trunk, a flicker of resolve in his eyes. "I can't keep living in the past," he said, his voice slightly stronger, more determined. "Lily, Sarah, they wouldn't want that." Cora nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. He had finally spoken his truth, had shared the crushing burden he had carried for so long. It was a small step, but a significant one. The echoes of the past still lingered in the silence of Wildwood, but now they were accompanied by the faint whisper of healing, the possibility of a future where Bear could finally forgive himself and perhaps even find happiness again. The shared vulnerability in the dusty attic had forged a deeper connection between them, a bond built on empathy and the quiet understanding of shared human pain. In the days that followed Bear's profound revelation, a subtle but deeply significant shift occurred in their relationship. The heavy veil of silence that had once separated them began to lift, slowly and carefully, like a rising curtain. It was replaced by a tentative trust, a fragile but powerful connection forged in the crucible of his shared pain. Bear, with a courage born of vulnerability, started to open up more, sharing candid anecdotes about his solitary life on the ranch before the tragedy. He spoke of the land with a loving familiarity, telling stories of its seasonal rhythms and the challenges of taming it. His voice, though still gruff and low, held a softer, more gentle tone when he spoke of his daughter, Lily, and his wife, Sarah. The raw pain that had once been a suffocating weight now seemed to be tinged with a gentle melancholy, a wistful remembrance rather than an open wound. Cora listened patiently, a quiet and compassionate presence. She offered words of comfort and understanding when appropriate, but mostly, she simply allowed him the space to share his memories without judgment. She saw that what he needed was not a fix for his grief, but a witness to it. Through his stories, she learned about his early life, his struggles to build Wildwood into the thriving, self-sufficient ranch it was, and the deep and abiding love he had shared with his family. She saw the immense strength that had allowed him to endure such profound loss, a quiet resilience that lay beneath his formidable and quiet exterior. One afternoon, while they were mending a long, sprawling fence line that stretched across the southern pasture, Cora felt a reciprocal urge to share. She spoke of her own past, her family back east, her decision to become a nurse and the hopes she had for a new life in the West, a life of purpose and independence. She didn't dwell on any personal tragedies, But the simple act of sharing created a powerful sense of reciprocity, a feeling that they were both revealing pieces of themselves, brick by brick, building a bridge of understanding between them. It was a silent agreement that they were in this together, two souls sharing their histories and their hopes. As their communication deepened, so did their reliance on each other. Cora's practical skills and compassionate nature complemented Bear's immense physical strength and his deep knowledge of the land. They worked together seamlessly, tending to the ranch, facing challenges as a united and efficient front. The initial awkwardness and formal politeness had faded entirely, replaced by a comfortable, easy companionship that felt as natural as the passing of the seasons. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long, satisfying day's work, watching the first stars begin to pepper the night sky, Cora noticed a subtle but definite change in Bear's demeanor. He seemed more relaxed, the usual tension in his massive shoulders finally eased. He even offered a small, hesitant smile when she recounted a humorous incident from her day, a story about a stubborn goat that refused to be herded. "You seem lighter," Cora observed gently, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet night. Bear looked out at the starlit landscape for a long contemplative moment before turning back to her. "Talking about them, it helped," he admitted, his voice low and raspy with emotion. "I've kept it bottled up for so long. It felt different, sharing it with you." Cora smiled warmly, a soft, encouraging gesture. "Sometimes, just having someone listen can make all the difference, Bear." A comfortable, peaceful silence settled between them, a silence that felt not empty, but full and companionable. The vastness of the Montana night, with its endless sky and distant wild sounds, seemed less daunting. The loneliness of Wildwood, once so profound and isolating, felt less pervasive, less absolute. They were two souls who had found solace in each other's presence, their shared vulnerability, forging a bond that was slowly but surely growing stronger. The tentative trust they had begun to build was a fragile thing, easily broken, but it held the promise of healing and the possibility of a future where the shadows of the past might finally begin to recede. The unspoken connection between them grew with each shared story, each shared silence, each gentle gesture, laying the foundation for something deeper, something neither of them could yet fully comprehend. It was a new beginning, taking root in the heart of a broken man. As the weeks passed, the connection between Bear and Cora deepened beyond a simple companionship, evolving into something richer and more profound. A quiet affection began to blossom between them, unspoken but evident in their shared knowing glances, their gentle and accidental touches, and the way they seemed to anticipate each other's needs and thoughts. Cora found herself increasingly drawn to Bear's quiet strength and the unexpected tenderness he showed beneath his gruff, hardened exterior. She admired his resilience, his deep and unwavering connection to the land he loved, and the vulnerability he had hesitantly revealed, a crack in the armor that made him more human, more accessible. Bear, in turn, found himself increasingly drawn to Cora's warmth, her unwavering optimism even in the face of adversity, and the genuine unselfish care she showed him. Her presence had filled the vast emptiness of Wildwood in a way he hadn't thought possible. He found himself looking forward to their daily conversations, to the sound of her laughter, and even to her gentle, chiding scoldings when he neglected a minor injury he had sustained during his work. She was a light in the darkness he had lived in for so long. One sunny afternoon, they were working together in the barn, a comfortable silence between them as they repaired a broken stall. Cora struggled to lift a heavy plank of wood, and before she could even ask for help, Bear, without a word, stepped in and effortlessly hoisted it into place. Their hands brushed as he steadied the plank for her, and a fleeting moment of powerful awareness passed between them, a spark of something more than friendship. Cora's cheeks flushed slightly, and Bear's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to his work, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. It was a brief, powerful moment, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in their relationship. Despite the growing affection between them, the shadow of the past and the lingering threat of the bandit still loomed over Wildwood, a constant, menacing presence. Bear was constantly aware of the danger Cora was in simply by being with him, a fear that echoed his past loss and the unshakable guilt he carried. He found himself torn between his desire to be close to her and his ingrained, agonizing belief that he was a harbinger of misfortune, that anyone he loved would inevitably be hurt. Cora, too, carried a quiet, persistent fear. She knew the risks of staying in such a remote and vulnerable place, especially after the attack, but her growing feelings for Bear and the profound sense of peace and belonging she had found at Wildwood despite its isolation kept her rooted there. She believed in Bear's strength and his ability to protect her, but she also worried about the emotional scars he still carried and the potential for further conflict. She worried that his past would always hold him hostage. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them felt heavier than usual, laden with unspoken fears. Cora finally broke it. "Bear," she said softly, her gaze earnest and direct. "I know you're worried about me, about what happened." Bear looked into the dancing flames, his expression troubled, his features a mask of internal conflict. "This isn't your fight, Cora. Those men, they were after us because I interfered with them. You got caught in the middle of a conflict that had nothing to do with you." "But I don't regret it," Cora said firmly, her voice resolute, "and I don't regret being here. I am where I am meant to be." Bear finally met her gaze, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and a burgeoning emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "But it's dangerous here," he said, his voice low and thick with genuine fear. "I don't want to see you get hurt because of me. And I don't want to see you live your life alone because of something that happened years ago," Cora countered, her voice gentle but unyielding. "We can't let fear control us, Bear. We have to face whatever comes together." Her words seemed to resonate deeply with him. He reached out and gently took her hand, his large calloused fingers enveloping hers, a powerful protective gesture. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent acknowledgement of the growing bond between them. "You're a strong woman, Cora," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Stronger than you know." "And so are you, Bear," she replied, squeezing his hand. "You've carried so much pain for so long. It's time to let some of it go, to let yourself live again." The unspoken affection that had been growing between them hung in the air, a fragile promise of something more. But the lingering fears and the potential for danger remained, casting a shadow over their burgeoning connection. They both knew that the path ahead would not be easy. But in that moment, holding hands by the flickering fire, they found a shared strength, a mutual understanding that they would face whatever came their way, together. The quiet corners of Wildwood, once filled only with Bear's profound solitude, now held the tentative whispers of a love trying to take root in the rugged landscape of the West. The uneasy calm that had settled over Wildwood after Cora's arrival was abruptly and brutally shattered by a series of unsettling events. It began subtly, with the small, inexplicable details that only a seasoned rancher would notice. A few of Bear's prize-winning cattle were found strayed, wandering far from their usual pasture, and bearing fresh brands that were not his. They were crude, ugly markings burned right over his own distinctive brand. Then, fences that had been sturdy and well-maintained just days before were now inexplicably cut, their taut wires lying slack on the ground. These were not the random acts of curious wildlife or the natural wear and tear of the elements. They were deliberate acts of aggression, a clear, unmistakable message that the threat from the bandits, or perhaps others, with similar and more malevolent intentions, had not diminished. The peace was an illusion. Bear grew increasingly watchful, his already keen patrols of the ranch becoming more frequent, and his demeanor more guarded, the stoic mask he wore now hardened with a grim resolve. He taught Cora basic firearm handling, insisting that she be able to protect herself in case of trouble. Cora, though initially hesitant and unfamiliar with the weight of a rifle, recognized the absolute necessity of his instruction and proved to be a quick and determined learner, her fierce resolve overcoming her lack of experience. She listened intently to his patient instructions, her hands steady as she learned to load, aim, and fire. She was not just a patient anymore, she was a participant in her own survival. One morning, Bear returned from his extensive rounds with a grim expression that sent a shiver down Cora's spine. He had found tracks near the southern boundary of the ranch, tracks that clearly belonged to more than just a few riders. They were heading relentlessly towards Wildwood, a silent, menacing tide of destruction. "They're coming back," he said to Cora, his voice flat with a chilling certainty. "We need to be ready." A knot of fear tightened in Cora's stomach, a cold, hard lump of dread, but she met his gaze with a steady, unwavering resolve that surprised even herself. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice calm despite the fear. "We prepare," Bear said, his eyes hardening with a grim determination. "We secure the house, we make sure we have enough supplies, and we defend what's ours. We will not be caught unawares again." Together, they worked tirelessly. The rhythm of their days, once so peaceful and quiet, was replaced by a frantic, purposeful energy. They reinforced the doors and windows of the ranch house, boarding them up with thick planks of wood. They brought in extra water and food, creating a small, self-sufficient fortress. They ensured their firearms were meticulously cleaned and loaded, a grim arsenal for the battle to come. Bear showed Cora strategic positions around the house from which she could defend, and they practiced their response in case of an attack, a grim, silent dance of survival. As they worked, a sense of grim determination settled over them. The peaceful rhythm of life at Wildwood had been broken, replaced by the stark reality of the danger they faced. The growing affection between them now had a sharp edge of urgency, a shared understanding of the stakes involved. This was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting the fragile new life they were building together. One evening, as they sat inside the fortified house, the only light coming from the crackling fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Cora asked Bear, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet. "Do you think they'll try to take the ranch?" Bear nodded slowly. "Wildwood is valuable land, good grazing, access to water. There are those who would gladly take it for themselves." He paused, his gaze meeting hers across the flickering light, a powerful sincerity in his eyes. "And now there's you. They know you're here." Cora reached across the small space separating them and placed her hand on his arm, her touch a comforting, anchoring weight. "We'll face them together, Bear, whatever happens." He covered her hand with his grip firm and warm. "I won't let them hurt you, Cora. I promise." The words were a solemn vow, a promise he had made once before and failed to keep. This time he would not fail. The night was filled with a tense silence, punctuated only by the crackling fire and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. They knew that the confrontation was inevitable, that the signs of trouble were a prelude to a storm that was about to break. The fragile peace they had found at Wildwood was about to be tested, and the strength of their growing bond would be their greatest defense against the dangers that were closing in. The quiet ranch, once a sanctuary of solitude, was now poised to become a battleground, and the giant rancher and the determined nurse stood ready to face the coming storm together. The attack came not at dawn, as they had half expected, but under the profound, suffocating cloak of a moonless night. The first jarring sign of trouble was the frantic, high-pitched barking of Bear's two loyal ranch dogs, their usually boisterous barks laced with an undeniable note of alarm and a primal fear. Bear was instantly awake, his senses honed by years of living in the wilderness. He nudged Cora gently, his hand already reaching for his rifle, and she was already stirring, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon beside the bed, a testament to her newfound vigilance. Peeking through the fortified window shutters, they could see shadowy figures moving with sinister intent around the perimeter of the ranch. The low murmur of hushed voices, carried on the cool night air, confirmed their worst fears. They were surrounded, trapped and outnumbered. "Stay low and behind cover," Bear whispered to Cora, his voice calm but firm, a steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "Only shoot if you have a clear shot. Don't waste a single bullet." The attack began with a sudden, deafening volley of gunfire, bullets thudding against the sturdy log walls of the house with a sickening sound. Bear returned fire, his aim steady despite the profound darkness, the flashes of his rifle a stark punctuation in the blackness. Cora, following his instructions with a chilling focus, positioned herself near a window overlooking the back of the property, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her chest, but her hands surprisingly steady on the trigger of the rifle. The attackers tried to breach the main door, their heavy blows echoing through the house like a relentless drum of destruction. Bear had reinforced it well, however, and it held firm, groaning but not breaking. Frustrated, the bandits began to fire more intensely, their bullets raining down on the house, hoping to shoot through the windows or set the house ablaze with a thrown torch. Hours crawled by in a blur of endless gunfire, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. Bear moved strategically from window to window, a ghost in the darkness, returning fire and keeping the attackers at bay with a brutal efficiency. Cora held her position, picking off any figure that came into clear sight, her shots surprisingly accurate and deadly. They worked together in a grim dance of survival, their earlier preparations proving to be their saving grace. At one point, a Molotov cocktail was thrown against the side of the house, the impact followed by the sickening smell of kerosene and the immediate lick of hungry orange flames. Bear reacted swiftly, grabbing buckets of water they had prepared and dousing the fire before it could spread, his movements quick and purposeful. He was a force of nature, a man fighting for his home. As the night wore on, the intensity of the attack began to wane. Perhaps the attackers were running low on ammunition, or perhaps they were deterred by Bear and Cora's determined, unyielding defense. By the first hint of dawn, the gunfire had ceased entirely, replaced by an eerie, profound silence. Bear cautiously approached a window and peered out. The shadowy figures had retreated, leaving behind a scene of utter destruction. Bullet holes scarred the walls of the house, and the ground around the perimeter was littered with debris, a battlefield littered with the remnants of their struggle. "It seems they've gone for now," Bear said, his voice weary but filled with a profound sense of relief. Cora emerged from her position, her face smudged with soot and dust, but her eyes bright with a powerful adrenaline. "Are you all right?" she asked, her gaze searching his for any sign of injury, her voice trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. Bear nodded, a rare, tired smile gracing his lips. "We made it through the night, thanks to you." They cautiously ventured outside, the ranch looking battered but not broken. The dogs, who had taken shelter in the barn during the attack, emerged wagging their tails, sensing the danger had passed. As they surveyed the damage, they both knew this was not the end. The attackers would likely return, perhaps with more men, more ruthless plans. But they had faced the siege together, and in doing so, their bond had been forged in the crucible of danger. The quiet affection that had been growing between them had now been tempered with a shared experience of survival, a deeper understanding of each other's strength and resilience. They had defended Wildwood, not just as individuals, but as a unit. And in the aftermath of the long night, the giant rancher and the determined nurse stood side by side, ready to face whatever the future held. The silence of dawn was not one of peace, but of a hard-won respite, a moment to gather their strength for the battles that were yet to come. The first hesitant rays of dawn slowly painted the sky, revealing the full and brutal extent of the siege on Wildwood. The once pristine log walls of the ranch house were now pocked with a multitude of bullet holes, like angry welts on sturdy skin. Several windows lay shattered, their broken glass glinting ominously in the new light, and the faint acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the crisp morning air, a lingering reminder of the fire that had almost consumed their home. Bear and Cora, their faces etched with the weariness of a sleepless night, walked the perimeter, their steps slow and deliberate as they surveyed the damage. Bear's face was a study in grim satisfaction. They had held their own against a determined foe, a testament to his foresight and their combined courage. Cora, however, felt a wave of cold reality wash over her. The attack had been terrifying, a stark, visceral reminder of the untamed brutality of this land, and the constant threat that simmered beneath its wild beauty. They spent the entire morning repairing the damage, their movements fueled by a potent mix of adrenaline and the profound need to restore a sense of normalcy, to reclaim their sanctuary from the ravages of conflict. Bear was silent, as was his custom during intense work, but he was also more protective than ever, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, his senses alert to every rustle of leaves, every distant sound. He was no longer just preparing for a potential attack. He was living with the certainty of another one. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that this was just the beginning, a prelude to a larger, more determined assault. The bandits who had tried to take his ranch were not the type to give up easily. They were like persistent, venomous insects, and he knew they would return. Cora, despite the lingering fear that tightened her stomach, found a newfound resilience blooming within herself. She had faced danger head-on, unflinching in the face of gunfire and fire, and she had not faltered. The empowering knowledge that she had actively contributed to their survival, that her actions had made a tangible difference, gave her a profound sense of empowerment. She wasn't just a guest or a patient anymore. She was a true partner in this fight, a co-defender of Wildwood. The shared experience, the crucible of battle, had solidified their bond in a way that months of peaceful coexistence, no matter how tender, could never have achieved. They had faced death together, and in doing so, had found a deeper, unbreakable connection. That evening, as they ate a quiet dinner by the flickering light of the hearth, the silence between them was different. It was no longer filled with unspoken questions or tentative gestures, no longer heavy with the weight of unshared burdens. It was a silence of shared understanding and profound mutual respect, a comfortable quiet born of shared ordeal. Cora looked at Bear, his massive frame now appearing less intimidating and more like a steadfast fortress, a bulwark against the world's harshness. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep lines a testament to the weight of the day pressing on him, and her heart went out to him with a wave of tenderness. "We did it," she said softly, her voice a gentle murmur that broke the peaceful quiet. Bear looked up from his plate, a weary but genuine smile touching his lips. "We did. We make a good team," Cora said, her voice filled with a genuine warmth that made his heart swell in his chest, a feeling he hadn't thought possible. "The best," he replied, his voice a low, rumbling acknowledgement, carrying a new depth of affection. This simple exchange was a powerful testament to their evolving relationship. They were no longer two lonely people coexisting in a vast space, each carrying their own silent burdens. They were a unit, a family forged by fire, bound by courage and a burgeoning love. The reality of their situation was harsh, the dangers of the untamed West ever present, but the comfort they found in each other's presence was a powerful counterweight, an anchor in a turbulent world. The siege had been a brutal test, but it had also been a profound catalyst, forcing them to confront their fears and rely on each other in a way they never had before. As the moon rose over the still ravaged landscape of Wildwood, casting long ethereal shadows across the land, they both knew that their lives had been irrevocably changed. The future was undeniably uncertain, filled with the palpable threat of more attacks and the unceasing need for constant vigilance, but for the first time in a long time, Bear did not feel a crushing sense of loneliness. He had Cora, and in her, he had found a home. The days following the terrifying siege were a demanding mix of continuous rebuilding and a heightened, almost frantic, alertness. Bear spent every waking moment either tirelessly working on the ranch, mending fences and tending to his recovering livestock, or diligently scouting the surrounding territory. He had to know if the bandits were still lurking nearby, their predatory eyes fixed on Wildwood, simply waiting for their next opportune moment to strike. Cora helped as much as she could, her keen eyes and practical mind proving to be invaluable assets. She would position herself from the highest point she could find on the ranch, often atop a sturdy rock formation, her heart in her throat with every distant movement, every swirl of dust on the horizon. One afternoon, Bear returned from his extensive scouting trip, his face etched with a grim and unsettling expression. He had found a small temporary encampment not far from Wildwood, hidden skillfully in a secluded copse of trees, but it was empty, abandoned in haste. The ground, however, held fresh tracks that told him everything he needed to know with chilling clarity. The bandits hadn't just retreated, they had gone to meet with a larger group, their numbers swelling, their intent undoubtedly more sinister. The tracks led relentlessly toward the property of a neighboring rancher named Silas Vance. a man known throughout the territory for his ruthless tactics, his insatiable greed, and his deep-seated personal animosity toward Bear. "Silas Vance," Bear uttered, his voice low and laced with a potent venom, the name a bitter taste on his tongue. "I should have known he was behind this all along." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture of calculated malice. Cora's blood ran cold. She had heard whispers and grim tales about Vance, a man whose reputation for brutality preceded him, a man who had tried to strong-arm Bear into selling him wildwood on more than one occasion. The recent siege was no longer just a random act of banditry. It was a calculated attempt to drive them off the land, orchestrated by a powerful and dangerous man who relentlessly coveted what Bear had painstakingly built. The implications were terrifying. "We can't fight them all, Bear," Cora said, a tremor barely perceptible but present in her voice. The thought of facing not just a few desperate bandits, but a full-fledged gang backed by a powerful, malevolent rancher was a daunting prospect that filled her with a chilling dread. "We won't have to," Bear said, his jaw set in a determined, unyielding line, his voice resonating with newfound purpose. "They think they can corner me. They think I'm all alone out here, a solitary giant easy to fell." A slow, dangerous glint appeared in his dark eyes, a spark of defiance. "They're about to find out they're wrong. Very, very wrong." His plan, though unarticulated, was clearly beginning to form. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks, Bear mounted Thunder, his powerful Mustang, and rode out. Cora watched him go from the porch, a sense of foreboding settling over her like a heavy shroud. He was not just scouting this time. He was going to confront the danger head-on, seeking not just information but allies. She trusted him implicitly, believed in his strength with every fiber of her being, but the thought of him riding into the very heart of a potential conflict, into the lion's den, was almost unbearable, a weight on her anxious heart. Bear rode for hours, the vast Montana landscape unfolding around him. His destination was a small ramshackle town on the wilder edge of the territory, a place where the law held little sway, where justice was often swift and brutal, and where a man's reputation, good or bad, was his only currency. He found the men he was looking for in a dimly lit, smoky saloon, a motley crew of rugged trappers and grizzled prospectors, men who lived by their own fierce code and who had no love for powerful land-grabbing ranchers like Silas Vance. They were outcasts, survivors, and exactly the kind of men Bear needed. Bear approached their table, his massive presence causing an immediate stir in the noisy, boisterous room. Conversations died down, and all eyes turned to the towering figure. He sat down, his gaze unwavering as he looked at the group's tacit leader, a grizzled old trapper with a face like a weathered, ancient map, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Heard you boys are looking for work," Bear said, his voice low and commanding, cutting through the residual silence. The trapper's eyes narrowed, studying Bear with a shrewd intensity. "Depends on the work, Caldwell. And who's paying?" Bear, without a word, laid a small, heavy bag of gold coins on the scarred wooden table. It was a king's ransom in this hard-scrabble part of the country, enough to buy loyalty and a great deal of effort. "I'm paying, and the work is simple. Help me defend what's mine. Help me send a clear, unequivocal message to Silas Vance that Wildwood is not for sale, and that I won't be easily driven from my land." The trapper's eyes widened at the sight of the gleaming gold. He looked at his men, and a silent, almost imperceptible agreement passed between them. They were rough men, with rough edges and a healthy disregard for authority, but they were also men who respected strength, courage, and a fair deal. Silas Vance was a bully, a predator who preyed on the weak. Bear Caldwell was a man who fought for what was his, a man who commanded respect. "Seems like you're the one who needs help, Caldwell," the trapper said, a flicker of admiration, almost grudging in his eyes. Bear looked him straight in the eye, his gaze piercing. "I don't need help. I'm offering a chance to make an honest living and send a powerful message to a man who thinks he owns this territory." The trapper let out a slow, satisfied smile, a genuine grin finally breaking through his weathered facade. "We're with you, Caldwell, for a price, and for the satisfaction of seeing Vance brought low." Bear nodded, a new sense of grim resolve hardening his gaze. He had Cora to protect, a legacy to defend, and a deep-seated desire to finally put an end to the incessant threats against Wildwood. He had found his allies. The lonely giant was no longer alone, and the coming battle would be fought not just for land, not just for a piece of property, but for the very life he was finally starting to build, a life filled with promise and a profound new connection. The return of Bear and his newly hired men to Wildwood was a sight to behold. The motley crew of rugged trappers and weathered prospectors, men who had once roamed the territory as solitary figures, now rode as a small but formidable army. Their horses moved in unison, a disciplined formation that spoke volumes about their newfound purpose. Their loyalty had been bought not just with gold, but with a profound and earned respect for a man who was willing to stand his ground against a known tyrant like Silas Vance. They had seen something in Bear, a quiet strength that mirrored their own hard-won resilience. Cora, watching from the porch, felt a sense of relief wash over her, a calming wave that momentarily settled the gnawing anxiety that had been her constant companion. The ranch was no longer an island of vulnerability, but this relief was mixed with a new, unsettling feeling. She had seen the raw power of these men in the way they carried themselves, the glint of steel in their eyes, the scars of a life lived on the edge of danger. She knew they were a necessary defense against Vance's ruthless gang, but their presence also changed the peaceful atmosphere of Wildwood, replacing the quiet solitude with a palpable sense of anticipation and readiness for a conflict that felt imminent. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension. Bear introduced her to the men, and she greeted them with a quiet dignity that surprised them. They had expected a frightened woman, a helpless damsel in distress, but instead they found a determined one who spoke with a clear, calm voice. Her presence seemed to have a calming effect on the group, a counterbalance to their hardened exterior and a stark contrast to the grim purpose of their gathering. She was a beacon of a different kind of strength, one of grace and unyielding resolve. Over the next few days, Wildwood became a hub of activity. The silence of the ranch was shattered by the rhythmic sound of hammers, the clatter of tools, and the low, muttered conversations of men at work. Bear and his new men fortified the ranch further, setting up defensive positions, building a new stable, and establishing patrol routes around the perimeter. They worked with a focused intensity, a grim understanding of the storm that was brewing on the horizon. The ranch, once a quiet sanctuary, was now a fortress, a symbol of resistance against a greedy, ruthless enemy. It was a physical manifestation of Bear's unyielding spirit. Cora, though not a fighter in the traditional sense, played a vital and indispensable role. She became the camp nurse, tending to the men's minor injuries, her compassionate nature a stark contrast to the grim reality of their preparations. She listened to their stories, learned their names, and treated them with a kindness they were not accustomed to. They, in turn, began to see her not just as Bear's friend, but as a respected part of their newfound alliance, a valuable member of their community. She was their anchor to the quiet, peaceful life they were fighting to protect. One evening, as the men sat around a campfire, their laughter and low voices a foreign but welcome sound on the ranch, Cora found Bear watching them from a distance. She approached him, a mug of hot coffee in her hand, the steam a small white cloud against the cool night air. "They trust you," she said, handing him the mug. Bear took a long sip, the warmth spreading through his hands. "They trust the gold, and they trust that I'm more stubborn than Vance." "It's more than that," Cora countered, her gaze steady. "They respect you, Bear, for standing up for what's right." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a rare sign of his inner emotions. What's right is what a man has to do to protect his home. The conversation turned to the coming conflict, and Bear explained his strategy, his voice filled with a calm confidence that reassured her. He had been a solitary figure for so long, a man who had relied only on himself, but in this moment he was a leader, a general preparing his troops for battle. He spoke of the land, of its strategic advantages, of the weaknesses of Vance's gang. He was not just a rancher, he was a master tactician, a man who understood the territory and the men who inhabited it. As he spoke, Cora saw the man he was meant to be, a man of power and resolve who could not only protect his own, but who could also inspire loyalty and trust in others. The man who had been so broken by his past was now finding a new purpose in protecting his future. The storm was coming, a powerful and violent clash that would decide the fate of Wildwood. But as Cora looked at Bear, standing tall against the darkening sky, she felt a profound sense of peace. They were no longer alone in this fight. The fortress of Wildwood had found its defenders, and the heart of the giant rancher, once filled with solitude and grief, was now filled with a new resolve, a new purpose, and a new reason to fight. The quiet moments before the storm were a testament to their strength, and the calm that now settled over them was a shared one, a silent acknowledgement that they were ready. Silas Vance was a man who was not accustomed to being denied. The news that his men had been repelled by a single man and a woman infuriated him, a personal affront to his authority and his formidable reputation. He had underestimated Caldwell, and that was a mistake he would not make again. He was not just a rancher. He was a ruthless businessman, and Wildwood was a prize he had coveted for years, a sprawling, valuable piece of land that he had no intention of letting slip through his fingers. He was a man of cunning and deceit, and he knew that a direct frontal assault on Wildwood, now fortified and manned by a new crew, would be a costly and bloody affair, a potential loss of men and resources he was not willing to risk. He needed a different approach, a plan that would circumvent Caldwell's new defenses. He needed to hit Bear where he was most vulnerable, to strike at the very heart of his newfound life. He had to make this personal. Vance had his men watch Wildwood from a distance, observing the movements of Caldwell and his new crew. He took note of the woman who was always by Caldwell's side, the one who seemed to be a constant presence in his life. He saw the way Caldwell looked at her, the protective way he hovered over her. It was a weakness, a chink in the giant's armor, a vulnerability he could exploit. Vance, a man who saw emotion as a liability, was confident he could use this against Caldwell. He sent a new group of men not to attack Wildwood directly, but to create diversions and sow chaos. Their mission was to steal Bear's cattle from a remote pasture, knowing that Caldwell, a man devoted to his land and his livestock, would have to ride out to deal with the loss. Their second mission was to set fires at strategic points on the ranch, forcing Caldwell to split his forces and leaving him vulnerable. The plan was a calculated risk, a gamble to draw Bear out of his fortress and into a confrontation on Vance's terms. Vance was confident that once Bear was separated from his men and his fortress, he would be a more manageable opponent, a heartbroken man who was easy to defeat. The first sign of the new plan came in the form of a cloud of smoke rising from a distant pasture. Bear saw it instantly and knew what it meant. His jaw tightened, a muscle clenching in his cheek. "They're trying to draw us out," he said to Cora, his voice grim. "They're trying to split our forces." "We can't just let them burn the land," Cora said, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She was no longer just a spectator. She was a part of this fight. Bear nodded, his mind already racing, calculating the risks and the rewards. "I know, but we can't split up our men, not all of them. I'll go with a few men. The rest will stay here to defend the house." He was a leader now, a man of quick decisions, but she saw the worry in his eyes. Cora looked at him, a sense of dread settling over her. "It's a trap, Bear. You know it is." "I know," he said, his gaze hard. "But I have to go. I won't let them destroy what I've built." He looked at her, his eyes softening, the love he felt for her a powerful, visible emotion. "Stay here, Cora. Stay safe. Don't open the doors for anyone but me." She nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. She knew he was going into danger, a pawn in Vance's twisted game, but she also knew that he had no choice. She trusted him to be smart, to be cautious, and to fight with the same strength and resolve that had brought him this far. As Bear and a small group of his men rode out, Cora watched them go, her heart a heavy weight in her chest. She had a new rifle in her hands and a new resolve in her heart. She was no longer a helpless victim. She was a defender, a guardian of the home that she had come to love. She had seen the lengths that Vance was willing to go to, and she knew that the battle for Wildwood was far from over. The storm was no longer just on the horizon. It had arrived, and Cora knew that she and Bear were in for the fight of their lives. Bear and his small group of men rode hard and fast, their horses' hooves kicking up dust in a frantic race against time. They followed the thick plume of smoke that billowed from the distant pasture, a black mark against the clear blue sky. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burning grass, a scent of deliberate destruction that fueled a primal sense of urgency in Bear. His mind, usually so clear and methodical, was a whirlwind of calculations and strategies. He knew this was a trap, a calculated move by Vance to draw him out from the relative safety of Wildwood. But he also knew, with a certainty that burned in his gut, that he couldn't just let his land burn. He was a caretaker of this land, and a man did not abandon his responsibility, even when a devious enemy was pulling the strings. As they approached the fire, they found it was a controlled blaze, a tactical distraction designed to lure them away from the main ranch. The real prize, they discovered, was a smaller herd of Bear's prized cattle being expertly driven off by a handful of Vance's men. Bear's fury flared, a primal rage at the brazenness of the act. This wasn't just a threat, it was a personal insult, a deliberate and calculated act of theft meant to cripple him. He gave the order to his men to flank the bandits, and a brief but intense skirmish ensued. A whirlwind of gunfire and shouts that echoed across the plains. Bear, riding thunder, was a force of nature. He moved with a speed that belied his immense size, his roars echoing across the plains as he fought with a ferocity that stunned Vance's men. He was not just a rancher defending his property, he was a giant defending his home, his way of life, and the woman he was beginning to love. The thought of Cora back at Wildwood filled him with a fierce, protective energy. He fought not just for the land, but for her, for their shared future. They managed to reclaim the cattle and force the bandits to retreat, a tactical victory that left a bitter taste in Bear's mouth. The victory felt hollow. He knew this was just the beginning of Vance's cruel and calculated game. He couldn't be everywhere at once, and Vance was counting on that, using his ranch's vastness as a weapon against him. Back at Wildwood, Cora and the remaining men were on high alert. The silence at the ranch was unnerving, a stark and eerie contrast to the distant, muffled sounds of gunfire. Cora, watching from the main house, felt a sense of powerlessness mixed with a fierce determination. She had to be ready, not just for an attack, but for whatever twisted plan Vance had in store. She paced the main room, her rifle close at hand, her mind racing with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She knew Vance was a man of cunning, and she had a feeling this little skirmish was just a prelude to something far more sinister. As dusk settled, casting long, menacing shadows across the ranch, a lone rider approached the gates of Wildwood. It was a young boy, no older than 12, on a small, tired horse. He looked scared and exhausted, his small frame trembling. Cora's heart went out to him, but her instincts, honed by the constant threat, kept her on guard. She called out to him from a safe distance, her rifle at the ready. The boy, his face smudged with dirt and tears, held up a small, folded piece of paper. "I have a message for Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice a small, trembling whisper. Cora was suspicious, but she couldn't ignore a child in distress. She instructed one of the men to retrieve the note, which was carefully unfolded and handed to her. The message was simple, but chilling. It was a map, with a single X marked on it and a short, brutal message. "Your choice, Caldwell, the ranch or the girl." Cora's blood ran cold. The girl. Vance was not just after Wildwood, he was after her. He knew the growing affection between her and Bear, and he was using it as a weapon, a perfect checkmate. The map was not a location, but a challenge. He was giving Bear a choice: surrender the ranch and everything he had built, or risk the life of the woman he was beginning to love. The note was a cruel and brilliant gambit, a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Vance knew that Bear, with his deep-seated guilt over losing his daughter Lily, would not hesitate to sacrifice everything to save her. When Bear returned, exhausted and grim from the fight, Cora showed him the note. He read it, his face paling with a fear she had never seen before. The fear was not for himself, but for her. He knew what he had to do. The ranch could be rebuilt, but a life once lost was gone forever. The weight of his past, the memory of his lost daughter, made the choice an easy but gut-wrenching one. He had to go to her, to save her, no matter the cost. The note from Silas Vance was a cruel and calculated blow, a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It was not a physical threat to Wildwood itself, but a direct assault on the heart of Arthur Caldwell. The choice was a torment of a kind Bear had never imagined. Surrender the legacy he had built with his own 2 hands, the land he had fought and bled for, or risk the life of the woman who had brought light back into his solitary world. It was a choice between everything he had and the one person who made it all worth having. Bear's face, usually a stoic mask of quiet strength, was etched with a profound despair. The memory of Lily, his daughter, flashed before his eyes, a phantom of a past failure that had haunted him for so long. He had made a promise to himself, a solemn vow born from the crucible of grief. He would never again allow someone he loved to come to harm because of his own actions or inactions. This was not just a threat from Vance, it was a direct confrontation with the one failure that had defined his life for years. He saw the familiar fear in his eyes, the deep-seated belief that his love was a curse, a magnet for tragedy, a terrible thing that only brought pain and loss. Cora watched him, her heart breaking for the torment he was enduring. She knew what this note represented to him, not just a threat to her life, but a direct and brutal confrontation with his deepest, darkest fears. She saw the familiar fear in his eyes, the deep-seated belief that his love was a curse, a magnet for tragedy, a terrible thing that only brought pain and loss. "Bear," she said softly, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "This is what he wants. He wants you to think you have to choose. He wants to break you." Bear looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, pleading anguish. "He knows what he's doing, Cora. He knows about Lily. He knows I can't risk losing you." He was not thinking rationally. He was consumed by the pain of his past. Cora stepped closer, her hands reaching for his, her touch a grounding force in the maelstrom of his grief. "And I know you, Bear. I know you're a man who doesn't give in to threats. I know you're a man who fights for what's right. We can't let him win, not like this." But Bear was not listening. The old fears had resurfaced, a tidal wave of guilt and pain that threatened to drown him. He was not thinking about strategy or about fighting Vance. He was thinking about saving Cora, about a future where he would be alone again, tormented by the ghost of a second chance he had been given and then lost. "I have to go," he said, his voice flat with grim resolve. "I have to go to him." "No," Cora pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. "Bear, please, this is exactly what he wants. He wants to lure you out there, alone and vulnerable. We can't give him what he wants." But Bear's mind was made up. He was already thinking ahead, making a plan. He would ride out alone. He would face Vance and his men. He would offer them the deed to Wildwood, a sacrifice that would ensure Cora's safety and his own emotional survival. He knew it was a desperate and dangerous plan, but he saw no other way. The ghosts of his past were holding him hostage, forcing him to choose a path of surrender, a path that would save Cora's life, but would also cost him everything he had built. Cora, seeing the look of utter determination in his eyes, knew she couldn't convince him. She knew that the only way to save him from himself was to take matters into her own hands. She had to show him that her life was not his to sacrifice, that they were in this together, and that her fate was not something to be gambled away. The storm had passed, but the true battle for Bear's soul, a battle against his own demons, was just beginning, and Cora knew she had to be ready to fight. Cora, realizing that her pleas to Bear were falling on deaf ears, knew she had to act quickly and decisively. He was so consumed by guilt and the ghosts of his past that he was willing to walk straight into a trap, sacrificing everything he had built for her safety. She could not, would not let him do that. He had lost his way, and she was the only one who could guide him back. She came up with a desperate and dangerous plan, one that would require her to use her wits and cunning against a man who believed he held all the cards. She would not let Bear go to Vance alone, nor would she let Vance win by dividing them. She would turn his own gambit against him, a perfect reversal of a checkmate. She would make him believe he had won, and then, at the last moment, she would show him the truth. She waited until Bear was occupied with his men, preparing for his departure. She approached one of the most trusted trappers, a man named Jesse, who had been a loyal friend to Bear in a short amount of time. She explained her plan to him, her voice filled with a quiet urgency and determination that left no room for argument. Jesse, who had come to respect Cora's strength and intelligence, listened intently, his weathered face a mask of concentration. "You're asking for a miracle, miss," he said when she was finished. "I'm asking for a chance to fight on our own terms," Cora countered. "Vance thinks he's playing a game of chess. It's time we showed him that we're playing a different game." Jesse looked at her, then at the towering figure of Bear, who was saddling Thunder with a grim look on his face. He knew that Bear, consumed by his grief and his need to protect Cora, was making a terrible mistake. He looked back at Cora and saw a flicker of the same resolve he had seen in Bear's eyes during the siege. He made his decision. "All right, miss," he said, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. "We'll play your game." Cora quickly wrote a note, a message to Vance that was short and to the point. It was a bluff, a declaration that she was no longer at Wildwood, that she had left on her own accord, and that if Vance wanted the deed to Wildwood, he would have to come and get it from Bear himself. She made it sound like she was running away, a scared woman who couldn't handle the pressure. It was a gamble, but she was counting on Vance's arrogance, his belief that she was a weak and frightened woman, to make him believe her words. She gave the note to Jesse, who was to send one of his men to deliver it to Vance's ranch as a message from an anonymous source. Then she prepared to leave. But she wasn't leaving Wildwood. She was simply going to hide, a ghost in the vastness of the land, a woman who would not be a pawn in Vance's game. She packed a small bag with provisions and a rifle, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She approached Bear, who was still consumed by his thoughts of her safety. "I need to go, Bear," she said softly. He looked at her, his face a mask of confusion. "Go? Go where? You can't leave now, it's too dangerous." "I'm not leaving forever," she said, her voice firm. "I'm just going to hide for a while. It's too dangerous for me to stay here. I'll be safe. You have to believe me." She knew he wouldn't, but she also knew she couldn't tell him the truth. He would never allow her to carry out her plan. Bear, seeing the resolute look in her eyes, knew he couldn't stop her. He watched her as she mounted a horse and rode out, disappearing into the vastness of the Montana landscape. A part of him felt a profound sense of failure, a feeling that he had driven her away. But another part of him felt a flicker of hope. She was a survivor, a fighter. She would be safe, or so he desperately wanted to believe. Cora rode for a short while, then dismounted and found a secluded cave, a perfect hiding spot that she had found weeks ago. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a woman of action, and she would not let Bear sacrifice himself for her. She was a silent observer, a ghost in the shadows, waiting for Vance's next move. She knew that the grand deception had been set in motion, and she was ready for the final act of this dangerous game. The anonymous message reached Silas Vance's ranch, a lone rider appearing from the vast expanse of the plains and disappearing just as quickly, leaving behind nothing but a sealed envelope. Vance took the note, his thick fingers breaking the wax seal with a snap. He read the contents, and a slow, malicious smile spread across his face, a grim and satisfied twist of his lips. The note's tone, full of feigned desperation and flight, played perfectly into his assumptions. The woman had run. She had abandoned the giant in his hour of need, a scared little mouse fleeing a cat. It was even better than he had hoped for. Vance had fully expected a protracted, bloody fight. He had anticipated a strategic choice, either to seize the ranch by force or to use the woman as leverage to force Caldwell's hand. But now the universe had delivered him an even more satisfying victory. He could have both. The woman was no longer a complication, just a temporary nuisance who had removed herself from the equation. The giant, left alone and vulnerable without his emotional anchor, would be his for the taking. The ranch would finally be his, and he would finally get his sweet revenge on the man who had dared to defy him, to stand tall when everyone else had bent the knee. He saw no trap, no ruse, only his own inevitable victory and the final humiliating defeat of the man who had stood in his way for so long. His immense ego, his unshakable belief in his own superiority, blinded him to the possibility of a woman's cunning. He gathered his men, not the half-hearted crew from the first failed raid, but a larger, more formidable group this time, the true core of his ruthless gang. He was not going for a siege. He was going for a knockout blow, a final assault that would leave Caldwell and his few remaining men with no choice but to surrender. He was confident, arrogant, and entirely blind to the fact that he was walking straight into a trap of his own making, orchestrated not by Bear but by the very person he had so foolishly underestimated. He saw himself as a grand strategist, but in reality, he was a pawn in a game he didn't even know was being played. Back at Wildwood, Bear was a man consumed by a silent, burning fury. The note from Cora had been delivered, and he had been left with the chilling words and the immediate, suffocating fear that she had truly left him. A part of him, the old, wounded part, was convinced that she had run because of him, because of the danger he represented. The guilt of his past failure with Lily resurfaced, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. He was furious at Vance for putting him in this position, for forcing him to relive his worst nightmare, but his anger was a complicated emotion, a shield for the deeper torment of believing he had lost Cora forever. He and his men were on high alert, but Bear's mind was not on the coming battle. It was on Cora, on her safety, on the overwhelming fear that he had lost her forever. He was a man of immense physical strength, but his emotional state was in shambles, his heart in a turmoil of grief and anger. He was a storm trapped in a body, a coiled spring of raw emotion waiting to snap. He was ready to fight, not for the ranch, but out of a desperate, furious grief. He had to be ready for whatever came, even if it meant fighting a battle with a broken heart. Jesse, the trapper who was the only one in on Cora's plan, watched Bear with a quiet concern. He knew that Bear in his current state was a wild card. He was unpredictable, consumed by his emotions, and ready to make a terrible mistake out of love and fear. He was also a man who was about to be blindsided by a grand deception. Jesse kept a careful silence, a silent guardian of Cora's plan, knowing that any word of the truth would ruin everything. The approaching riders, Vance and his men, were a sight to behold. A thick cloud of dust rose behind them, a testament to their numbers and their confidence. They were not being stealthy. They were a force, a storm rolling across the plains, convinced that they had the upper hand, that they were about to deliver the final blow to a broken man. Bear watched them approach, a grim resolve on his face. He was ready to fight, but he was also ready to surrender if it meant keeping Cora safe. He had no idea that she was watching the entire scene from her hiding spot, a silent guardian, a woman who had taken matters into her own hands. Vance was about to learn a harsh lesson, that a woman's strength should never be underestimated, and that the grand deception had only just begun. The final act of this dangerous drama was about to unfold, and Cora was ready to make her move, to show the world that a true fortress is not made of wood and stone, but of love and cunning. Silas Vance, leading his men, rode onto Wildwood with the arrogance of a conqueror, a confident smirk on his face. He found Bear and his men standing ready, a small but formidable line of defense, their faces grim and their guns at the ready. Vance let out a short, humorless laugh, a sound of contempt that echoed across the plains. "Looks like you're ready for a fight, Caldwell," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I told you, I'm not here to fight. I'm here for what's mine. You give me the deed, and I'll leave you and your men in peace." Bear, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line, remained silent. He looked at Vance, his eyes burning with a silent rage that Vance mistook for defeat. Vance continued, his voice a cruel purr. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you'll fight me for the ranch, but let's be honest, Caldwell. What's a piece of paper compared to a life? What's a ranch compared to the woman who ran away from you, who was too afraid to face a fight with you?" He was counting on his words to break Bear, to make him surrender everything for the illusion of Cora's safety. For a moment, it seemed to be working. Bear's shoulders slumped, a wave of despair washing over him, a physical manifestation of his emotional turmoil. "I want the deed, Caldwell," Vance said, his voice a low, final threat. "Now, or I'll take it by force." Bear, his mind a whirlwind of torment, was about to surrender. He was about to hand over everything he had built for the illusion of Cora's safety. He was ready to sacrifice his legacy, his home, his future, to ensure that the ghosts of his past would not return. But at that precise moment, a voice echoed across the plains, a clear, strong voice that rang out like a bell. "Don't you dare, Bear Caldwell!" Vance and his men were stunned. They turned as one to the sound of the voice, and they saw her. Cora, standing on a rocky outcrop, her rifle raised, her face a mask of furious determination. She had not run away. She had been there all along, a silent guardian, a hidden strength waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Vance's face twisted in a mixture of shock and enraged disbelief. He had been outsmarted, not by Bear, but by the woman he had dismissed as a frightened damsel. He looked from her to Bear, and he saw the truth in their eyes. He had been played. "You have been played, Silas Vance," Cora yelled, her voice filled with a powerful contempt. "You thought you could break this man by playing on his fears, but what you didn't realize is that he is stronger than any fear, and he is not alone. He is stronger than any man I've met, and he will never let you win." Vance, enraged by her defiance, drew his gun. But before he could fire, Bear, who had been listening to her words, to the words that had filled him with a new sense of resolve, sprang into action. The despair that had gripped him vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective rage. He had been given a second chance, a second life, and he would not let Vance take it from him. He had been so lost in his own mind, but Cora's voice had been a beacon, a light in the darkness, pulling him back to the man he was meant to be. A fierce gunfight erupted. Bear and his men, now fighting with a renewed sense of purpose, were a formidable force. They were not just fighting for land, they were fighting for each other, for their new community, for the future they were building together. Cora, from her vantage point, provided deadly cover fire, her shots accurate and deadly, a silent partner in the battle. The battle was short and brutal. Vance's men, surprised and outmaneuvered, were no match for the combined force of Bear's men and Cora's cunning. Vance, seeing his plan crumble before his eyes, tried to flee, but Bear, with a rage born of 1,000 nights of torment, pursued him relentlessly. He disarmed Vance and tackled him, the two of them a tangled mass of limbs and fury. Bear's rage was a raw, primal thing, and for a moment Cora feared he would kill Vance, but he didn't. He held Vance pinned to the ground, his voice a low growl of pure contempt. "You thought you could break me," he said, his voice filled with a powerful contempt. "But you just made me stronger." Vance, defeated and humiliated, could only stare up at the giant who had not only bested him, but who had also been saved by the woman he had so foolishly underestimated. The final stand had been fought and won, and the lonely giant had finally found his home, his purpose, and the woman who had helped him defeat his own demons. The silence that followed the gunfight was not one of defeat, but one of a hard-won victory, a testament to the strength of love and the power of a woman who had dared to believe in a man who had lost all hope. The silence that fell over Wildwood after the final shots were fired was a heavy, profound thing. It was a silence not of absence but of completion. The echoes of gunfire were replaced by the quiet sounds of the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the distant murmur of men tending to the fallen. Silas Vance, defeated and humiliated, lay on the dusty ground, his ego shattered, his scheme in ruins. Bear stood over him, a towering figure of justice and defiance. The rage that had fueled him, the wild, desperate energy that had consumed him, had subsided, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. He had faced his greatest fear, had confronted the ghost of his past, and had emerged victorious not just in a gunfight, but in a battle for his own soul. Cora, watching from her vantage point, felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with a profound sense of relief. The danger was over. The game had ended, and they had won. She descended from the outcrop, her movements quick and purposeful. She reached Bear's side and, without a word, wrapped her arms around him. His massive body, which had been so tense and rigid with fury and despair, relaxed against her touch. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent, a grounding force in the chaos. "You're bigger than any man I've met," she whispered, her voice filled with a powerful love and admiration. "You fought for me, you fought for yourself." Bear, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions he had kept bottled up for so long, finally broke. The weight of his past, the guilt, the grief, the despair, all of it came crashing down on him. He had been so focused on protecting her, on not repeating the same mistakes, that he had never allowed himself to feel the full weight of his love for her. And now, in this moment of victory, surrounded by the remnants of the battle, he collapsed in tears. It was a raw, guttural sob that shook his entire frame, a sound of profound release. The lonely giant, the man who had carried the world on his shoulders, was finally allowing himself to be vulnerable, to be human. He was not a fortress, he was a man who had been broken and was finally beginning to heal. Cora held him, her own tears falling freely. She did not try to comfort him with words. She simply held him, her small frame a beacon of strength against his immense body. She let him cry, letting him release the years of pain and guilt that he had kept locked away. She knew this was a moment of profound importance, a turning point in his life. He was not just crying for Lily. He was crying for himself, for the man he had been and the man he was becoming. He was shedding the skin of his past, ready to step into a new, brighter future. After a long while, Bear's sobs subsided. He pulled back, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his eyes red but clear. He looked at Cora, and a look of deep, abiding love passed between them, a silent promise of a future they had both been too afraid to hope for. The other men, who had watched the scene with a quiet respect, began to clean up the battlefield. They rounded up Vance and his men, tying them up and preparing to take them to the nearest town to face justice. They had seen a side of Bear they had never expected, and it had only deepened their respect for him. He was not just a powerful man, he was a man of heart, a man who had fought for what was right and had won. As the sun set, casting a golden light over the ravaged landscape of Wildwood, Bear and Cora stood together, their hands intertwined. The silence was different now. It was not a silence of loss or emptiness. It was a silence of peace, of a hard-won victory, of a new beginning. The ghost of Lily would always be a part of him, a memory of a love that was lost. But it would no longer be a torment. It would be a memory, a part of the past that had shaped him, but that would no longer define him. He had found a new purpose, a new reason to live, and a new life with the woman who had helped him defeat his own demons. The final chapter of his old life had ended, and the first chapter of his new life, a life filled with hope, love, and the promise of a shared future, was just beginning. With the battle over and the enemy subdued, Bear and his men had a new task, transporting the captured bandits and their defeated leader, Silas Vance, to the nearest town with a functioning lawman. The journey was long and arduous, a slow procession across the vast, open plains. It was a journey of justice, a final act of retribution against the man who had brought so much pain, but for Bear and Cora, it was also a journey of healing. As they rode, side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, the unspoken words between them were more powerful than any conversation. They had faced a life-or-death situation, had confronted their deepest fears, and had come out on the other side, stronger and more connected than ever before. The physical wounds of the battle were minor, but the emotional ones, particularly for Bear, were finally beginning to close, leaving a sense of quiet peace. The journey gave them time to talk, to truly talk, for the first time since the attack. They spoke of the fear they had felt, the desperation of the final confrontation, and the profound relief of the victory. Cora spoke of her trust in him, a trust that had not wavered even when he had been consumed by his own demons. Bear, in turn, spoke of the moment he had heard her voice, a voice that had cut through his despair and had filled him with a new, powerful resolve. He admitted to her that he had been ready to surrender, to give up everything for her safety, and that her defiance had been the thing that had saved him from himself. He had been so lost, so ready to give in, and it was her voice that had pulled him back to the land of the living. "I would have lost everything," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I would have lost Wildwood, and I would have lost myself. You saved me, Cora." "We saved each other," she replied, a gentle smile on her face. "You saved my life, and I helped you find yours again. We're in this together, Bear." The words were simple, but they held a lifetime of meaning. They were not two separate people anymore. They were a unit, a team, a partnership forged in the fires of adversity. The men who had witnessed their leader's emotional transformation watched them with a quiet admiration. They had seen the unyielding giant of Wildwood, but now they saw a man who was capable of profound love and vulnerability. They saw a man who was no longer alone, and who was stronger for it. He was not just a leader of men, he was a man who was finally at peace with himself. The town, when they finally reached it, was a small dusty outpost, a place where law was often a suggestion rather than a rule. But the reputation of Bear Caldwell had preceded them. The lawman, a grizzled old man with a world-weary look in his eyes, had heard the stories of the attack on Wildwood. When he saw the defeated Silas Vance and his gang, he knew that the reign of terror was over. Bear handed Vance over to the lawman, his gaze unwavering. "He attacked my ranch. He threatened my home. He threatened my family," he said, his voice firm and resolute. The word family hung in the air, a new and powerful declaration that marked the final end of his solitude. The lawman nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. He knew that some men had to make their own justice in this wild land, and he respected the way Bear had handled it. He took Vance and his men into custody, and the people of the town, who had lived in fear of the Vance gang, came out of their homes to cheer for the man who had brought peace back to their valley. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the town, Bear and Cora stood together, watching the final act of justice unfold. The journey had been long, but it had been worth it. They had faced a ruthless enemy, had confronted their own inner demons, and had emerged victorious. The old life, the life of a solitary giant haunted by the past, was finally over. The new life, a life filled with the promise of a shared future, was finally beginning. They had a long way to go, a life to build together, but for the first time in a long time, Bear felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his home, not just in a piece of land, but in the heart of the woman who stood beside him. The dust settled, both literally and figuratively, over Wildwood. With Silas Vance and his men in the custody of the law, a profound and final peace descended upon the valley. Bear and Cora, now a united front, returned to the ranch with their new allies, no longer as desperate warriors, but as caretakers of a future they were building together. The very air at Wildwood, once heavy with the weight of Bear's solitude and the recent threat of violence, now felt lighter, infused with the scent of pine and the quiet anticipation of what was to come. It was the calm after the storm, and in this calm a new life was taking root. The men who had helped Bear in the final confrontation were not just hired hands, they were allies forged in fire. Bear paid them handsomely, as promised, but the bonds formed went far beyond a monetary exchange. A few of them, having found a sense of purpose and a camaraderie they hadn't known since leaving their own homes, chose to stay on. They offered their loyalty and their considerable skills to the man who had not only paid them fairly, but had also fought alongside them. The lonely giant was now the leader of a small but dedicated community, a family forged not by blood, but by a shared experience of survival, and a profound respect for the man who had brought them all together. The quiet camp that had sprung up on the ranch's outskirts became a testament to Bear's newfound leadership, a place where men shared stories and laughter, and where a sense of belonging finally took hold. The physical rebuilding of Wildwood began in earnest, a tangible manifestation of their new beginning. Every hammer blow, every nail driven into the sturdy timber was an act of defiance against the past and a declaration of their future. They repaired the bullet holes that had scarred the walls, replaced the shattered window panes with new clear glass, and restored the fences that had been broken, ensuring the ranch was secure and beautiful once more. This work was more than just maintenance. It was a deeply personal process of healing. Each repaired plank, each mended fence, was a symbol of their resilience, a testament to their love for the land and for each other. They were not just restoring a ranch. They were restoring a life, piece by painstaking piece. As they worked, their relationship deepened in a way that words alone could never capture. It moved beyond the unspoken affection of two people in a shared space to a tangible, loving partnership. They were a perfect balance of strength and compassion, of quiet resolve and gentle understanding. Bear, no longer weighed down by the crushing guilt of his past, was a man transformed. His gruff exterior, once a fortress, had softened into a warm, gentle presence. He was more open, more communicative, sharing not just facts about the ranch, but also his thoughts, his dreams, and his fears. He laughed more easily, his deep, rumbling laughter a welcome and joyful sound on the ranch, a stark contrast to the silence that had once defined his life. He found joy in the small things, a shared meal on the porch, a quiet moment watching the sunset, the simple, powerful act of holding Cora's hand. Cora, too, was blossoming. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a creator. She took on the role of co-leader, offering her ideas and her compassion to the men who worked on the ranch. She helped organize the work schedules, managed supplies with her practical mind, and most importantly, she brought a sense of home to a place that had been empty for so long. She baked bread that filled the house with a comforting aroma, planted a small flower garden that added vibrant color to the landscape, and tended to the men's minor injuries with a gentle expertise that earned their unwavering respect. She had found a purpose that went beyond her profession. She was a nurturer, a partner, and a pillar of strength. She belonged here, a place where she was loved and valued for who she was, not just for what she could do. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the first stars begin to pepper the night sky, Bear took her hand in his. The scars on his hands, the marks of a life of hard work and struggle, felt strangely comforting against her own. They were the physical reminders of a journey that had led him to this very moment. He turned to her, his voice low and serious. "I've been thinking," he said. "This ranch, it's a part of me. It's my legacy. But it's also our future, our home. And I want to build that home with you, Cora. I want to build a life with you. I want to have a family with you." Cora's heart swelled with a powerful love and a profound sense of peace. She had come to the West looking for a new life, and she had found something more than she could have ever dreamed of. She had found a home, a purpose, and a man who had fought his way back from despair to find his way to her. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a powerful emotion that transcended words. "Yes, Bear. I want that too." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love, and for the first time since the attack, she saw no fear, no guilt, no pain. She saw only a future filled with hope, a future that they were building together brick by brick, with a love that was as powerful and as unyielding as the land itself. The final act of his old life had been a reckoning, a moment of profound sadness and release, but the first act of his new life was a rebirth, a promise of a future that was finally, truly, their own. The spring that followed the confrontation was not just a change in season, it was a profound rebirth at Wildwood. The land, once scarred by fire and violence, was now a tapestry of lush, vibrant green, the new grass growing tall and wild, a testament to the indomitable resilience of nature. The ranch itself, too, was undergoing its own profound transformation, reflecting the new life within its walls. With the dedicated help of the men who had chosen to stay, the ranch house was not just repaired, but beautifully expanded. A new wing was added, with sturdy timbers and wide windows, a tangible sign of their growing family and community. This was no longer just a functional homestead, it was a place of growth, a place with a future. The ranch, once a solitary fortress, was now a vibrant testament to Bear's newfound life. The empty, echoing spaces of the main house were now filled with the warmth of shared laughter, the comforting sounds of a small community working together, and the quiet, peaceful moments that he and Cora found in each other's arms. The scent of fresh-baked bread, a new skill Cora had taken on, wafted through the air, a welcome and comforting change from the smell of dust and gunpowder that had so recently hung over the property. This was the scent of home, a scent Bear had not known in years. Bear, once a man defined by his immense strength and his haunting silence, was now a leader, a mentor, and a loving partner. He taught his men the intricate ways of the land, sharing his vast knowledge of cattle ranching, from the art of reading the weather to the science of breeding the best stock. He was fair but firm, and his men respected him not just for his imposing strength, but for his quiet wisdom and his unwavering loyalty to those he cared about. His gruff voice, once used for commands, was now used for guidance and encouragement. Cora, in her new role, was a force of nature, a quiet but powerful presence that brought a profound sense of order and structure to the rugged life of the ranch. She helped manage the finances, organized supplies with a meticulous eye, and oversaw the daily operations with an efficiency that surprised everyone. But more than that, she brought a sense of humanity and warmth. She was the one who tended to the men's minor injuries with her gentle expertise, the one who listened to their problems with a compassionate ear, and the one who made sure everyone had enough to eat and a warm place to rest. She had found a purpose that went far beyond her profession as a nurse. She was a creator, a nurturer, and a partner in every sense of the word. Their love story, once a delicate and fragile thing born out of violence and desperation, had blossomed into a powerful, unshakable bond. They were a team, a unit. They made every decision together, faced every challenge as one, and found a deep and abiding joy in the simple everyday moments of their lives. Bear, the man who had once believed his love was a curse, now saw it as his greatest strength, the very thing that had saved him. Cora, the woman who had come west looking for a new life, had found a life that was more meaningful and fulfilling than she could have ever imagined. One evening, as they sat on the porch, enjoying a quiet moment of reflection, Bear looked out at the sprawling ranch. The men were working in the distance, a sight of purpose and harmony. The cattle grazed peacefully on the rolling hills, a symbol of their prosperity. The setting sun cast a golden light over the land, painting a picture of tranquility and peace. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "I can't believe it's real." "It is," Cora replied, her hand in his. "It's a beautiful life, Bear." He turned to her, his gaze filled with a profound love that transcended words. I never thought I would have this again. I never thought I would be happy again." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of sorrow. "Happiness isn't something you find, Bear," Cora said, her voice soft and gentle. "It's something you create, and we created this together." She was right. They had created this life from the ashes of a tragedy, from the ruins of a past that had almost consumed them both. They had built a future, a home, and a love that was as vast and as unyielding as the Montana landscape itself. Wildwood, once a symbol of a man's solitude, was now a symbol of a future reborn, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unshakable bond between two people who had found their way back to each other, to themselves, and to a life that was finally truly their own. The rebirth of Wildwood was not just a physical one, it was a profound emotional one, a testament to the power of human connection and the promise of a future filled with love and hope. It was a victory not of strength alone, but of the heart. The years that followed the rebirth of Wildwood were marked by a serene, steady rhythm of life. The seasons turned, bringing with them a cycle of planting and harvesting, of new births and quiet moments of reflection. Wildwood flourished under Bear and Cora's combined leadership, its reputation as a haven of prosperity and peace spreading far beyond the valley. The small community of men that had formed in the aftermath of the siege grew, their families joining them and building their own homes. The ranch became a model for what a community could be, a place where people looked out for each other, where a man's word was his bond, and where the values of hard work and compassion were held above all else. Bear's reputation as a fair and just man was a legend in its own right, and he was sought out for advice, for wisdom, and for his unyielding sense of right and wrong. Bear and Cora's love for each other deepened with each passing year, growing and evolving into a profound, comfortable, and unshakable bond. They were a team in every sense of the word, a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect, love, and a shared history of trials and triumphs. They had faced down a ruthless enemy, had overcome the ghosts of the past, and had built a life together that was more fulfilling than either of them could have ever dreamed of. Their love was not a tempestuous fire, but a deep, steady warmth, a quiet understanding that was more powerful than any passion. They had learned to read each other's thoughts with a glance, to find comfort in a shared silence, and to draw strength from each other's presence. One crisp autumn morning, a new life came to Wildwood, marking a profound new chapter in their story. Cora gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby boy, a child with his mother's bright, intelligent eyes and his father's immense, powerful hands. They named him Arthur after his father, but they called him Artie, a name filled with a gentle, loving affection that was a testament to the warmth of their home. For Bear, the birth of his son was a moment of profound joy and a final powerful exorcism of his past grief. He looked at the tiny, fragile life in his arms, and a wave of emotions washed over him. He was a father again, a role he had believed was forever lost to him. The fear that had once consumed him, the fear that he would lose this child too, was gone. It had been replaced by a powerful, unshakable love, a love that was not haunted by the past, but filled with the hope of a shared future. He held his son, his massive hands incredibly gentle, and a sense of profound peace settled over him. He looked at Cora, her face tired but radiant, and he saw the woman who had saved him. The woman who had fought for him, who had shown him that he was worthy of love, and who had given him a second chance at life, at happiness, at being a father. "He's perfect, Cora," he said, his voice thick with emotion, a sound that was a mix of awe and gratitude. "He is," she replied, a gentle smile on her face. "He's ours, Bear." The words were simple, but they held the weight of a world reborn. The years of solitude, the grief, the fear, all of it had led him to this moment. It had been a long and arduous journey, filled with pain and despair, but it had been worth it. He had found a new life, a new purpose, and a new family. He was no longer a lonely giant, a man haunted by the past. He was a husband, a father, a leader, a man who had finally found his home. The story of the giant rancher who had collapsed in tears was not a story of defeat, but a story of triumph. It was a story of a man who had faced his demons and had emerged victorious, a man who had found his way back to himself and to a life that was filled with a powerful, unshakable love. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer defined him. It was a part of his story, a part of the journey that had led him to this moment, to this life, to this family. The final chapters of his story were not about a battle against an outside enemy, but about a battle for his own soul. And in the end, with the love of a woman who had seen the man behind the giant, he had won. The years continued to pass, turning the pages of the story of Bear and Cora, a story that became a legend in the valley. Their love was a testament to the power of resilience, to the strength of a bond forged in the crucible of danger, and nurtured by a shared history of triumphs and trials. Their son, Artie, grew up strong and kind, with his father's quiet strength and his mother's gentle compassion. He was a living legacy of their journey, a boy who learned about love, courage, and honor not from books, but from the quiet example of his parents. Wildwood, once a fortress of solitude, was now a vibrant, thriving community. The families who had joined them, the men who had fought alongside Bear, had built their own homes on the land, and the ranch was now a village, a place where people lived and worked together, a place where they looked out for each other. The old ranch house, once a silent monument to a man's grief, was now the heart of a bustling community, filled with the sounds of children playing and the low murmur of conversation. Bear and Cora, now older and wiser, watched their lives unfold with a quiet contentment that was more profound than any grand emotion. They had faced down a ruthless enemy, had overcome the ghosts of the past, and had built a life that was more beautiful and more fulfilling than they could have ever imagined. They had found a home, a purpose, and a love that was as deep and as vast as the Montana sky itself. Their love story was a quiet one, told not in grand gestures but in the small everyday moments of their lives. It was in the way Bear's massive hand would instinctively reach for Cora's when they were sitting on the porch, in the way she would gently brush a stray hair from his forehead as he worked, in the way they would simply sit in silence, comfortable and at peace in each other's presence. It was a love that had stood the test of time, a love that was built on a foundation of trust, respect, and a shared understanding of the human heart. One evening, as they sat on the porch, their hands intertwined, watching the stars begin to pepper the night sky, Bear looked at Cora, his eyes filled with a lifetime of love and gratitude. "Thank you, Cora," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, a sound that held all the weight of his heart. "For what, my love?" she replied, her voice soft and gentle. "For everything," he said, his gaze unwavering. "For seeing me, for not giving up on me, for loving me." The words were simple, but they were the most profound he had ever spoken. "I never had a choice," she said, a gentle smile on her face. "You're a good man, Bear Caldwell, you always were. You just needed someone to remind you." The truth of her words hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had been on. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, loving kiss that spoke of 1,000 unspoken words. He was not a giant who was haunted by his past. He was a man who was loved, a man who had found his home, and a man who had finally, truly, found peace. The legacy of Bear and Cora was not just the prosperity of Wildwood, but the simple, beautiful truth that love can heal the deepest wounds, that courage can conquer the greatest fears, and that a home is not just a place, but a feeling that is found in the heart of the person you love. The story of the giant rancher who had collapsed in tears was not a story of defeat, but a story of triumph, a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity and to find love, peace, and happiness in the unlikeliest of places. The final chapter of Bear and Cora's story was not an ending but a continuation, a quiet, peaceful sunset to a life well lived. They had found their home in Wildwood, but they had also found their home in each other's hearts. The past was no longer a torment, but a part of their shared history, a testament to the journey that had led them to this moment, to this life, to this profound love. They had faced down a ruthless enemy, had overcome the ghosts of the past, and had built a life together that was more fulfilling than either of them could have ever imagined. They had found a purpose, a community, and a love that was as deep and as vast as the Montana sky itself. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, the air crisp and the stars a brilliant tapestry above them, Bear looked at Cora, and a powerful sense of peace washed over him. He had everything he had ever wanted, everything he had ever needed. He had a home, a family, and a love that was as strong and as unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them. He reached for her hand and brought it to his lips, a simple, loving gesture that spoke of a lifetime of gratitude. "I love you, Cora," he said, his voice a low, heartfelt whisper, "with my whole heart. Always." "I love you too, Bear," she replied, her gaze filled with a profound love. "To the end of the line, and beyond." He smiled, a deep, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. He was no longer a man who was burdened by his past. He was a man who was loved, a man who had found his home, and a man who had finally, truly, found peace. The legacy of their love was not just the prosperity of Wildwood, but the simple, beautiful truth that a home is not just a place, but a feeling that is found in the heart of the person you love. The final chapter of their story was not about a victory against an outside enemy, but about a victory for their own hearts, a testament to the power of human connection and the promise of a future filled with love, peace, and the quiet joy of a shared life. The giant rancher had finally found his home, not just in the rugged landscape of the West, but in the heart of the woman who had helped him heal, to love, and to finally, truly, live again. He had found his purpose in her, his strength in their shared journey, and his final lasting peace in her embrace.